Many of you on such a nationally momentous day. I trust you all voted or will have time to if you haven't yet. 55 years ago, Oliver Schroeder Jr., who was then in his fifth year of teaching law here at what was then Western Reserve School of Law, founded the modern field of health law when, together with a professor of pathology and Sam Gerber, then the county coroner, he started something called the Law Medicine Center, what is now sort of an archaic-sounding term, but then captured a field which he really created, starting out training people in the medical field, teaching them about the law so that they could be expert witnesses in medical cases. They could be forensic pathologists. They could bring their medical expertise into the courtroom. And over the years, Ollie's vision grew. Flattery, the imitation is the best flattery. So over the years, additional law schools started centers focused on healthcare law. And over time, the field emerged as not so much the use of medical evidence in the law or medicine in the law, but the role of law in medical services, in the delivery and the safety and the equitable access to medical care. And so those are the issues that our students grapple with today. Ollie sadly passed away on September 25th. He was at the great age of 92. When he retired, which was back in 1986, retired from this faculty, an endowment was created in his name, and the money is used to bring a prominent individual to the campus to give a series of talks. This individual is one who has made a major contribution in the fields of health law and policy. And I'm confident that Ollie would be extremely pleased at this year's Schroeder Scholar, Arthur Caplan. Just as Ollie founded the modern field of health law, Art founded a field of his own, which is the modern persona of the public bioethicist. He was a resident scholar at the Hastings Center in the 1980s, and he decided that bioethical debates, which had previously been pretty much confined to the halls of academia, some religious institutions, needed to be in the public eye, that they were addressing issues of major public import, and that they needed to be part of the public conversation. And so he began to speak in public groups. He began to appear in the media. And he has indeed, as I'm sure you're all aware, become the most well-known bioethicist in the country. He's regularly consulted and quoted by the media, as well as by scholars, clinicians, and government officials. Not only is he highly visible, but he's also highly respected. Art, I think it's fair to say, simply gets it right. When Tom Murray left our medical school to become president of the Hastings Center, which is one of the premier bioethics think tanks in this country, when he left our school, what was to become our Department of Bioethics, but when he left in 1999, we had a little roast for Tom when he left, and I gave one of the roast talks, and I Googled Tom at that time. Actually, I lycosed him because hardly anyone, I think, knew Google in 1999, and I wanted to see how eminent he was, and 30 entries popped up, none of which had anything to do with our Tom Murray. So I thought, well, maybe there's a sort of a gap in the internet that it just doesn't know about bioethics, and there's nothing about bioethicists on. So as a control, I Googled Art. There were 105,468 hits in 1999. As one journalist said about Art in 1994, moral and ethical dilemmas are his meat and potatoes. Well, I know we will have a meaty talk from Art today on his topic, which is the ethics of trying to increase, or what is and what is not, ethical, in trying to increase the supply of organs for transplantation. So please join me in welcoming Arthur Caplan, the 2008-2009 Schroeder Scholar.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I don't get a chance to meet Professor Schroeder himself, but I'm very proud to have the chance to speak in his name. And it's great to be at Case, where I have so many friends and our program at Penn has so many close connections to people working, particularly both in the law school and in the Department of Bioethics. So it's just, I was telling Max when I looked out the window today, I did a talk a little bit earlier for the law school only, sort of a very private, moving talk, that we were to the point where I could look out the window and identify all buildings that I saw out there. So let's see if I can get this thing to fire up. Just wanted to show. Anybody know what the icon is for display?
You want to show? Yeah. Let me get it for you. That's one place, anyway.
Before Google, also, I'm not used to anything but Macintosh. Anyway, what I'm going to do is talk to you about a problem that I've been wrestling with ever since I got interested in bioethics. When I first got interested in the subject way back at the Columbia Medical School, when I came in there as a graduate student in philosophy and started to do some rounds and see what was going on in the hospital, one thing that became very clear was that there were an awful lot of people competing for slots on kidney dialysis. And yet, there weren't, we knew how to do transplants. People were doing transplants of kidneys at that time, but there weren't many kidneys to give to people. And so you had this big backlog on dialysis. As some of you will know in the room, when you're on dialysis, eventually you run out of access points. Also, people, some of them don't do very well on dialysis. And so the competition was extreme in the sense in which people would die because they couldn't use kidney dialysis anymore. Some never got on in the first place. Some died because they ran out of the ability to get the treatment. And the question became, why aren't we doing more transplants? It turned out that one of the reasons that we weren't doing more transplants is there weren't kidneys to give to people. And so I got interested at that time in what was the procedure for getting organs for people to transplant. And we're talking here basically in the early 80s. It's hard for me to even admit to this or say that this was true, but in New York City at that time, each individual hospital operated their own organ procurement team. And they would compete with other hospitals in New York City to get donors. And so if you got there first at the site of someone who was on a life support machine and died and could make a claim that you were there first and were going to take primarily the kidneys at that time, you got them. Not only was it competitive, if you got there first, you tried to use those organs in your own hospital with people on your own waiting list. Hello. You'll be checking this story out. When you tried to use these organs on people in your own hospital, if you couldn't find a match or get somebody to accept these organs, you would have thought they would have shared them with other hospitals. No, they didn't. Actually, the competition was so fierce that organs went to waste because hospitals would not exchange or share. There was no system to do it, and a lot of people basically said, you know, my job is to transplant my list of people. If I don't transplant them here and they go over to another institution, then we're going to lose all that business. We're not going to do it. So organs were tossed rather than given to people who were waiting for kidneys. It was possible to think of ways to improve this system. One idea was, why don't we have a consortium? And one of the first networks to form was the New York Transplant Consortium, which agreed, after some arm twisting and yelling that I was involved in, to set up a system to at least share organs around the New York City hospitals. Now, you have to remember, in the 1980s, preservation wasn't that good. Transport was a problem. There were other reasons why you weren't going to move organs to Cleveland or California. There were technical issues. But you could move them around the city, and they began to be shared. The next thing I found out was there was no policy or requirement that people ask about organ donation. So when someone died, it was up to the local hospital if they wanted to bring up the subject of organ donation. I mean, we're talking about from cadaver sources here. Well, a lot of hospitals didn't. In fact, there were disincentives to do it. If you brought up organ donation, Then you tied up a bed in your ICU. It wasn't clear who was going to pay for the post-death care of this person in the ICU. And you had to go through a lot of rigmarole to try and find a team to come to your place to get this organ. So a lot of hospitals just didn't do anything. They didn't ask about organ donation. They didn't bring it up. So I began to think, well, what could be done to improve on that situation? You can see you got to be really smart to be in bioethics here. And it did occur to me that maybe we could get them to ask as opposed to not ask. That was a big insight I had. I thought about it for a long time and got to that conclusion. It took a lot of careful reading of Emmanuel Kant, but I realized if you asked, you were more likely to get something than if you didn't ask. So I proposed a law and proposed it in New York State. And I never proposed a law to anybody, and I didn't know how to write one. So I began to fish around to see what legislator might help me both write this law and put it in for consideration in the state legislature that when someone died, if they were deemed suitable for organ donation, somebody should ask the family, the next of kin, about organ donation. This became what's known as required request. And the person I found was a man named William Cadillac Smith, so named because he drove around Albany in a gigantic Cadillac. When he wasn't accepting graft, he was in the big Cadillac. And he was from up in Big Flats, New York somewhere, in upstate. I could never quite figure out where he was from. I'm not sure it mattered anymore since he controlled completely all the voting that had sent him to the New York State Legislature. He didn't seem to be concerned if you were registered or alive or dead. But he had had a family member die, and he always had wondered why they hadn't been an organ donor, and that was the connection. We immediately encountered fierce opposition from a source I never thought would oppose us, and it was the New York State bishops, Catholic bishops. Now, why were they against organ donation at that time? It was because they weren't sure that they could accept the idea of brain death. And the issue really was one that has not gone away, lo these 30 years. If you accept the idea of brain death, will that be used to determine when life begins, brain life, and would that symmetry cause problems for opposition to abortion? So the bishops said no to this idea of acquiring request. And then I had my third big insight as a policy maker. I said, well, I think I know how to get the bishops to drop their opposition. What we need is a Catholic kid, his picture, and we'll put an op-ed piece in the Albany paper, not the New York Times where all the eggheads wanted to go, but where the state legislators read the paper at the time. This is pre-internet. And I found a kid on a waiting list, got a name from one of the New York hospitals, Joey Kaharkic, and he needed a kidney transplant. I wrote an op-ed saying, the only thing that stands between Joey and life are the New York bishops. And then opposition ceased and the bill went through. It was that simple. They couldn't take that kind of heat. Nice young Polish, what was Joe Biden's term for Obama? Clean and, presentable. Well, here he was. Joey was clean and presentable and well-spoken, and there wasn't much you're going to do to croak him, so off they went. I tell you these stories, actually for no purpose other than to amuse myself. No, I tell you these stories because I've been involved for a long time in thinking about ways to get more organs. A lot of effort is underway now. Much of what you're going to hear about today, I suspect you aren't aware of or haven't tracked, that has me nervous. And I took out this title. It isn't quite the one I sent ahead of time, but I've been thinking about a better title. And so extremism in the name of obtaining organs, it should say, is no virtue. Anybody recognize that quote? Barry Goldwater. So this is a little honorific to Goldwater, who had a quote about extremism in defense of liberty is not a virtue. And what I'm worried about is that we're starting to see ideas percolate, some legislative, some policy, that are, in my opinion, extreme and could do damage to the system of organ donation and organ procurement that we built up. I'm not against trying to do things that will get us more organs. We need to do that. As you can see, when I was chasing around kidneys back in the early 80s, the waiting lists for kidneys were in the hundreds. They are long past those numbers, and now we have added livers, hearts, lungs, multiple organ transplants. In fact, in some parts of the world, composite tissues like limbs and faces. There are many people, over 100,000 in the US alone, who are listed by the national network that was formed to distribute organs, UNOS. And these are people, many of whom are going to die this week because there's no organ to give them. The most desperate group are children, newborns, often born with heart defects. Very tough to get a pediatric heart donor. Babies happily do not die in situations where they have their brains injured and the rest of them remains healthy. It's rare to find a pediatric donor. The waiting list there, I would say, for newborns who need heart transplants, probably 80% of that group is going to die without a transplant. So that's the toughest crowd. But even in kidneys, probably a third of the list dies. So it's a significant number of people going without organs, and it has led to calls, which you're going to hear about in a minute, to do something, to change policy, to change practice, to try and get more organs. I have to point out, this number 100,000 pops up in many, many articles, many peer-reviewed articles in the academic literature. It also pops up in the media all the time. It's a little deceptive because it's actually an undercount. There are more than 100,000 people out there who could get transplants. Some are not listed because there are centers who are not going to take them because they don't have insurance. Some are not listed because there are centers who are going to say, we don't do prisoners. We don't accept people with severe mental disability. It's clear that there is underrepresentation on waiting lists of people who have severe mental disability. We haven't quite decided in this country what to do with illegal aliens. Are we going to put them on our list? We're not going to put them on our list. Some of you will remember the sad case of Jessica Santillan, who was at Duke, who got a mismatched organ and got a second set of organs, but nonetheless died. What wasn't recalled at the time or didn't draw a lot of discussion is that Jessica was an illegal alien who had come into the country under the sponsorship of a friendly person who agreed to pay her costs. No one argued about whether Jessica deserved a second set of organs, even though the data on repeat transplants when you start initially with a mismatch is zero survival, because Jessica was a child. But if you had taken a farm worker who had snuck in, I think Lou Dobbs would have been on TV for the next month screaming about how are we transplanting illegal aliens, at public expense in our hospitals. So some places do, some don't. We certainly don't open up the list to the world. There are many places in the world that don't have the capacity to do transplants. Some could come here. Occasionally somebody does. But in general, it's an undercount, if you will, on those who wait. And as I think many of you also know, most transplant centers are not dealing with people older than 70. So there's a quiet triage that goes on. If there was an ample supply of organs, if we had funded embryonic stem cell research or adult stem cell research or some form of repair that would allow people to step in and replace damaged cells in kidneys or hearts, there would be many, many more older people, older than 70, who'd start to get these operations. They're just not there because everybody knows they're going to the bottom of the list, and that's a sort of non-referral from the primary care people to transplant teams. Every once in a while somebody does someone 75 or older. There's a program at UCLA that uses older organs in older recipients as an experiment, but in general, they're not on the list either. So it's an undercount. Transplant, by the way, makes its own problems. When you start to watch how transplant has moved in this country, I have to say this, not only do we need organs because people are dying, transplant is pretty lucrative. It's a very lucrative thing for hospitals to do. The surgery is lucrative. It's even better when someone has to stay in the hospital for a while after a transplant. They don't do quite as well. They need a lot of intensive care. That can make hospitals money. I've talked to our hospital director, and nothing seems to make him smile as much at the hospital. University of Pennsylvania is a nice 60-day inpatient stay of a liver patient, so that runs a lot of reimbursed bills there. More to the point, the capacity to do transplant continues to grow in the U.S., so there are a lot of centers that can do it. A lot of good training goes on. I think it's fair to say, and I'm an outsider here, I don't have a dog in the fight, but I think we're the world leaders easily in the ability to do transplants, and that means that the capacity grows, but the supply remains pretty much stagnant. So we're not keeping up with the demand, and we're not keeping up with the capacity. Both of those generate enormous pressure to do something to get more organs. So what kinds of things are out there that are being proposed? One is that we go away in our system from reliance on the traditional ethical framework that has been in place since the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act was enacted in 1968, or at least recommended to states to enact in 1968. I have to be careful in a law school not to botch that up. Each state passes a law governing organ donation. It's not a federal matter, it's a state matter. The model statute that was recommended said, look, how are we going to have a system in place to do this? How many of you know about, have signed, have seen donor cards? So those came into existence in 1968, and most people believe that they came into existence because that was a way to facilitate getting organs. But it's not true. The reason donor cards and the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act came into existence was a scandal. If you hang around bioethics long enough, as I have, you quickly come to realize that you wake up every day praying for a scandal. There's nothing like a scandal to drive the field forward, raise budgets, things begin to happen. If things are happy and good and all is well, the ethics starts to slide. But this scandal was at the NIH. And what was involved was the procurement of pituitary glands. We didn't have the ability to make synthetic growth hormone back in the mid-60s. If you had pituitary dwarfism in a child, you were trying to extract growth hormone from pituitary glands. The NIH instituted a program where around the country they asked people to send them pituitary glands, but they didn't ask them to get permission. So pituitary glands were coming into the NIH, they were extracting growth hormone, things are fine. One day somebody says, what's that tiny hole in the back of Dad's head? And it turned out that this led to a scandal. The surreptitious removal of pituitary glands by the thousands was going on. So that led to action, and the action was the donor card. And what the donor card did was it said this: in order to obtain tissues or organs for transplant, you have to get the permission of the person while they're alive, prior to their demise, or next of kin. Voluntary informed consent has to be in place. You can't just take tissues or organs from the dead. So that's where the donor card comes from. It's a protection of the individual's right to decide whether or not they want to be a donor, or the next of kin's right to decide what they're going to do with their loved one if there's no indication of what that person would have wanted. Voluntary informed consent and altruism. When the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act was put through, there were discussions about should we pay people, should we create markets, and the general idea was it's dangerous, for reasons you'll hear about in a minute, to institute markets in body parts. One concern from the cadaver end of things was this: everybody close their eyes. How many of you worry or know someone who worries that they're not going to carry a donor card because they fear that the doctors might not treat them if they have such a card? Give me a hand. Okay. You can open your eyes, although it might be tempting to keep them closed at this point, given the way this talk's going. There are a lot of people who know someone. I know someone like that, my spouse. There are many people who say, I'm not carrying around a card that says, use me for parts. I don't trust doctors. I don't trust the system. They're going to give it to a celebrity. They're going to give it to the rich white people. I don't know who they're going to give it to, but it won't be me, and they're just going to kill me. If I show up there and I'm kind of on the edge, they'll say goodbye to me. That market incentive made the problem worse. If you said, not only can you get an organ, but get this, we'll pay your estate when you're dead. You could get $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 if you agree to do this. And people had this image of, I like my dad, but tuition is coming due, and there's vacations we could take. So markets were discouraged on the grounds that they would create counter incentives to people to sign up for fear that they would not get aggressive medical treatment. It's also the reason, if Stuart Youngner from your place were here today, he and I have written about this over the years, that we have had a policy that says very clearly you don't take organs from people until they're dead, and the pronouncement of death has to be done by people not connected to organ procurement. It's to make the public understand and trust the system that there isn't any hanky-panky about hustling people off prematurely without an effort in order to get their parts. So the system we have is informed consent from those who give or next of kin, that's the donor card, and altruism. No money is exchanging hands. These days, there are calls to change that and think about markets. I'm going to say some more about that in a little bit. Some of you know, in the New England Journal, back in August, there was a remarkable discussion. A group at Harvard proposed, following some work in Denver, that we change the definition of cardiac death to allow people to take organs out of children with waiting as little as 50 seconds for the heart, once the heart is stopped, to remove that heart for transplant. Now, part of the reason that's so is that hearts are very fragile, and if you don't get oxygen to them once you stop, you got to get them out of there quickly. But part of the reason is that they basically said, look, the dead donor rule, the idea that you have to be dead before we remove organs, is crazy if you're dealing with a child who suffered a terminal injury or a clear terminal illness. Then what are we waiting for? Why do we have to wait till they're dead? We know they're going to be dead. What we're doing is killing the kids on that waiting list who don't have any don't have organs to give them, and that doesn't make sense. So there have been calls, if you will, to redefine death so as to permit people who are on the road to death or down a path from which they can't recover to become donors, particularly for organs like hearts, which, as I say, are the most fragile ones, the most difficult to obtain if you don't move quickly to get them. Other ideas. I don't remember what the Ohio law is, but in a number of states, legislation has been introduced to modify that old Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, the act in 1968, the voluntary altruism donor card legislation. What these proposed changes in that law say is, if you filled out an advance directive and say, I want pain control, or this is what I want when I'm dying, or don't prolong my dying if I'm becoming unconscious, or if I suffer a lot of pain, that if you also have a donor card, that the donor card will trump your advance directive. So that the maximization of the chance to get organs would restrict what doctors would do to maintain your dying or honor your wishes about how you're dying. So we put more priority on your wish to be an organ donor than we would your wish to die in the manner that you direct. That clearly, by the way, is an incursion across the dead donor rule, right? So it's saying modify how you die in order to maximize organs. A number of states, not Ohio, but others, have instituted registries. So when you get your driver's license, you have to register as an organ donor. But they only give you one choice, yes. That's somewhat not good with informed consent. Kind of would like to have yes, no, maybe, or something like that, but not just yes. Some states have even said you can't get your organ donor card. You can't get your driver's license without filling out your organ donor card request, so that it's mandatory that you have to sign up. No one's passed it yet, but the bills are rattling around. In some situations, members of the transplant team are becoming part of the hospital end-of-life care team. And as we stand here today, see if I can get to this guy. There's a trial, I thought I had him up there, taking place in California of an individual physician who's charged with hastening death in order to get organs. You've probably seen this case in the news. His name is Rusrock. You'll be reading about him later this week as soon as the election results are all petered out. And he's charged with basically presenting himself as the procuring surgeon making himself part of the end-of-life care team at the hospital where he worked so that he was in closer contact than he should have been in trying to get organs from a particular individual. And the family sued saying, we thought he was part of the caring team. We had no idea he was part of the organ procurement team. That's the charge. I don't know what the facts will turn out to be. But it is right smack in the middle of this practice of starting to let people who procure organs start to become part of the care team or the treatment team. And that has issues of its own. We still have a lot of people using organs from individuals who are not pronounced brain dead. You can't always do that. I know that I was making a comment about the bishop's concern about brain death. We don't worry about brain death anymore. Society has come to accept it. The protocols are out there and are used all the time. There's always a little back chatter about making sure that you really have determined that you have a total and irreversible loss of all brain function using all possible technology. All possible technology might include PET and CAT scanning people as part of their dying, which is very expensive and I don't think we're going to see, but occasionally get that kind of chatter. But in general, brain death is accepted. Strangely enough, what never got clearly defined was the criteria for cardiac death. There is no national standard for cardiac death. When hospitals want to take organs from someone who suffered a traumatic brain injury, gunshot, head crush, where you couldn't do a brain death test, they have to pronounce people dead. They do it on the basis of cardiac death. Your heart stopped, time to bring up the issue of organ donation and organ procurement. The question is, for adults and children, how long do you wait? I told you that the team out in Harvard and this group out in Denver proposed 50 seconds for newborns. At the Cleveland Clinic, I think the protocol there is wait 2 minutes. There are some hospitals that wait up to 5 minutes before pronouncing cardiac death, and this group will particularly like this. As I often say, that leaves 3 minutes for the right lawyer. I mean, that's like a malpractice case waiting to come and happen. So no one's done it yet, but I'm expecting. And we don't have anything other than local ethics committees laying out the rules of how long you have to wait. So the clinic does it, University Hospital might do it, Penn might do it. There are all kinds of CHOP. Actually, at my place, the Children's Hospital has a different policy than the adult hospital, even though we're in the same place. They wait a minute more. It's not standardized yet. So we're operating without national guidelines when we can't determine brain death anymore. We also don't have national guidelines. As some of you know, we've gone and started to use a lot of living donors, particularly for kidneys. 2 years ago, the number of kidneys obtained in the U.S. for transplant, we exceeded cadaver donation. More people were giving organs who were alive to family members, or in some cases strangers, than we got from dead people. But there still are no standards for screening the living. So you have programs out there now, and this is where the extremism comes in the name of doing a good thing. Some programs will say, we don't do much in the way of an evaluation or review of a living donor. If they want to come and donate, great. Why should we turn into the police and start to grill them? Are you getting paid under the table? Is that really your cousin? Someone shows up and says, I have a history of anorexia, but I think it's gone now. Can they be a living donor to their sister? Some places they can, some places they can't. If you have a history of high blood pressure, if you have a history of many different types of medical problems, are you in or out? And I can tell you, having done some studies recently on this, that there is no national standard in place, or even minimal guidelines in place, about who ought to be allowed to be a living donor. So that opens up obvious problems about whether we're going to get in trouble here if someone dies because we basically don't have a standard, a minimal standard that centers ought to apply. There hasn't been aggressive pursuit of what I'll call trafficking and transplant tourism. Here I have to out myself in a conflict of interest. I am the chair of the United Nations European Union Committee on Trafficking in Organs. I know what's going on a bit around the world when people go to poor countries, offer money to poor people, and take usually kidneys and move them to other places, or in some parts of the world use prisoners whom they execute to get those organs, or in some parts of the world let rich people come to the transplant hospital in China or the Philippines, and they find them a donor, and from a living person, a kidney is removed and given to the rich person. It goes on. It's not a huge practice. It's not something that really goes on within the United States. I can tell you that UNOS is pretty good about, or our organizations are pretty good about policing that. But worldwide, there is an increasing market in trafficking in organs, and the world hasn't done a whole lot about it. It goes on out there. One simple thing to do would be to say, if you transplant an organ, then you're responsible for knowing where it came from. If it was bought, it's your problem if you use it. But that simple principle of provenance, as it might be called, has not been put into place. So we do see people sort of winking at trafficking and transplant tourism without being aggressive about it. Why am I so worried about all these things that I'm telling you about? Markets and not having a standard definition of cardiac death, and not being careful about who might be a living donor, and not being tough on trafficking. I think it's because, first of all, support for organ donation is pretty fragile. Most surveys show that people want to be organ donors. If you ask them in the abstract, do you want to donate organs when you die? They say yes. But there's a kind of weird Bradley effect here. When push comes to shove, only about 55% of those people do something when they die, or their families. So there's a big gap between what they say they'll do and what they really do. That big gap is very fragile. If this guy out in California gets convicted of hastening a death, it will set back donation in California for a year. You'll see it just tank. All kinds of scandals, all kinds of problems that pop up in transplant, whether it's Mickey Mantle getting a transplant and giving the appearance that celebrities go first, or many other problems like that, lead to immediate dips in people's willingness to sign donor cards or to act on organ donation as next of kin when someone dies. So it's fragile. You start jerking it around in ways that make people nervous or make them wonder, are people who give these organs really dead? Is money on the line? What's going on with trafficking? You could really wind up damaging the supply of organs without increasing the supply of organs. Donors have interest too. I mean, both the dead and the living. It always seemed to me interesting. Some states have passed laws recently that said, no matter what the family says, if you have a donor card, that should be complied with. So a mandatory comply with your donor card. And actually, the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act makes it perfectly legal to act on the basis of a donor card despite family consent. You don't need those laws, although states seem to think, I guess they don't read their own laws very often at the legislature, so they pass these laws reaffirming it. Let's be nice about it. The problem when you reaffirm it is this: death is not just a personal matter. Doctors who deal with dying will tell you that they shift their concern when someone dies to the family. And the family grieves, and the family has to cope with this loss. Now, you can tell them they're disenfranchised, and you can tell them this is a land of personal and individual liberty. You don't give a damn what they think ought to happen, but that puts you in the elegant position of saying, we got the card, and we're removing his liver, and we don't care whether you scream in the hallway, widow. We don't care. Don't we care? I mean, we care nothing about what the family thinks here? So I'm not sure that protecting donor interests isn't something that we have to do both for living persons who want to give a kidney, having minimal standards about who can do that, how competent they have to be, not letting poor people worldwide get exploited, and I'm happy to do this in question and answer, but having seen some of the people who had their kidneys purchased, exploited would be a generous estimate of what they believe they're going through when they're selling their kidneys. And we also know that scandals can risk destroying support for organ donation. So it's nice to think of policy changes, new sources, changes within the system. My comment is the reason I'm worried about what I'm dubbing extremism is that you can collapse the system pretty quickly. So that is just to remind you again, what's the moral framework we operate with today? Voluntary and informed, altruistic from the donors. The recipients are supposed to be able to make their choices about getting transplanted, and we have the dead donor rule that we don't kill We don't exploit and we don't coerce to get parts. Coercion is for the living. We don't bully you into doing it. If you don't want to give an organ to your brother, you can discuss it at Thanksgiving, but we won't make you. We don't exploit. That's what the trafficking problem is. And we don't kill, and that's what the problem is if you don't have standardized criteria for pronouncing death in adults and children. You're risking starting to push across the dead donor rule. It's the problem that happens if you let the transplant procurement people start to show up at the bedside too soon. You're hinting that management of a dying person is now moving over into the hands of procurement before the caring team has decided that's enough. And it's the problem if you start to have advanced directives trumped by organ donor cards, which I think is the worst idea I ever heard of. It's going to freak people out no end if they think, oh, you're not going to control my pain because that might interfere with the viability of my organs? I mean, what's a faster route to getting somebody to tear up their donor card? By the way, tearing up your donor card, I use that metaphor a lot. Most people have it on their driver's license, which is impossible to tear up. And it did occur to me once that it may not be the best place to actually try to get public support for organ donation at motor vehicles. Motor vehicles is an accident of history. It used to be that before we had seat belts and before we had drunk driving laws, you got a lot of donors from car accidents. So motor vehicles was the place to go. The problem is twofold. Last time I went in Pennsylvania, I'm sure in an enlightened state like Ohio this doesn't happen, but I went in Pennsylvania and I got my driver's license renewed and I said, I want to be an organ donor, and the guy said, I wouldn't do that. And I said, why? And he said, well, you know, they kill you if you have that card. So that may not be the place to do it, although there is an advantage. If you do get your donor card at motor vehicles, there's a pretty good chance you can die there waiting, and then they can just collect you. There are ideas, I didn't even get into some of these. How many of you have heard about the idea of a donor ambulance in New York and Philly? So one proposal is that we create a special ambulance that will follow the ordinary ambulance and try to intubate you in the field so that you could potentially donate organs, that we don't just have a dead person out in the street with no life support. Remember, for solid vital organs, you have to be on life support. So we get you dead. We know you're dead. You're pronounced out in the street. But then we wire you up quickly to life support in the special ambulance and bring you back to the hospital so we can talk about organ donation. So I keep thinking, which section of Philadelphia or Cleveland would go bonkers first when the donor ambulance drove up? And somebody said, well, really, he's dead. We're just here because there's some opportunity to get their parts, and then the neighborhood goes right out of their tree. I mean, it's I don't know, good luck. The idea is floating, and people think they can implement this without getting resistance from the public. Most people think ambulance, hope. They're not going to really be all that moved by the black ambulance that shows up that says, you know, we don't do that. So that's another, you know, it's an idea, but it may not be the best idea. Believe it or not, one of the things I want to spend a little bit of time talking about here, just briefly, is the push in organ and trying to get organs toward using riskier people. So some of you may know, when you're dealing with potential donors, you try to figure out from their history or testing them whether they have infectious diseases that they might transmit to recipients. You don't really want to get transmissible cancers, hepatitis C, HIV can be a problem. So you're trying very hard to make sure that you're not giving somebody a disease when you give them a transplant. But some centers have been not as vigilant as they might be in making sure that they disclose what they know about a donor or a donor's history to potential recipients, because they're trying to get more organs. Seeking a good goal, there's cutting corners a bit on what they disclose. So that's what we call the problem of risky donors, risky organs, or so-called marginal donors. They can be sicker, they can be older. We coined the term in some of our writing at Penn. They can be complex because they have disorders and diseases. It's another way these days to try and get more organs. So here's my next question to you all. if Dean Gilmore was at his usual bathhouse in Cleveland and fell over dead with a needle in his arm, and you're on the waiting list for a transplant, do you want to know this? Or would you say, Dr. Miller, you're the expert surgeon, you decide if Dean Gilmore's organs, despite his oddball lifestyle, are suitable to be transplanted. And you two can work it out. So anyway, so the point is this. There are people who are tagged as at risk of perhaps having a communicable disease or having problems just because they die in circumstances where people might say, well, they might be a high-risk donor. We don't have a whole lot of time to test them. We don't have a lot of time to get a family history. What are we going to do, in the pool or out of the pool? Then there are organs that come out, and you look at them, and I've seen this happen a lot, sometimes peering over the likes of Dr. Miller's shoulder, and somebody's going to say, well, that's a fatty liver. I don't know. Do we use it or we don't use it? And there's usually some discussion. Some say, well, at some centers I think so. Other places might say, I'm passing on that one. We don't want it. If you want to send it somewhere else, go ahead. There are versions of that happen just as it's not a matter of ethical malice. It's just reality and the way the world is. The question is, in pursuit of getting more organs, how much of this do you disclose to individuals who are waiting for organs? And the answer right now is not much. So there's a big lawsuit in Chicago. A liver, other organs were taken out of a donor who had hepatitis C. The allegation is the hospital knew it. They just said, we're going to put these organs into the system and distribute them. 5 people got hepatitis C. They're all suing this Chicago institution now for the failure to disclose. Not that they used the organs, but they didn't talk about whether or not these individuals wanted to take them or pass on them. Now, for certain organs, hearts and livers, I don't think there's going to be a lot of passing because they don't come up that often, and you might say, I'll take my chances even with the fatty liver and the risky donor. In other situations like kidneys, if you're starting to think, I got Uncle Fred and I got this not so good kidney, you might take Uncle Fred. And so those possibilities do start to open up, but we haven't put that into the system right now. So again, just to repeat, we have a framework, voluntary, altruistic, informed donation to get these organs. We have the notion that the individual recipients have some right to know what's going on, but in pushing to get the supply expanded, we're not doing a good job, in my view, keeping the potential recipients somewhat in the loop of having certain choices that they might or might not want to make. And I can talk a little more about how that might be practical in a little bit. But let me, in the interest of time and leaving some room for questions, I'm going to show you the best for last. There is a proposal, I haven't even mentioned this law, the National Organ Transplant Act. Remember I told you about the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act and the stealing the pituitaries and where that law model statute came from. We had one other bit of key legislation. In 1984, the National Organ Transplant Act was passed, which helped create the system that shares organs nationally now, but also explicitly forbade the sale of organs. And the person who promoted that legislation when he wasn't inventing the internet was Al Gore. I testified at these hearings. I know what went on there. And one of the reasons this bill passed, including a prohibition on sale of organs, very simply is this. There was a guy around who said, I'm going to create a brokerage in organs. And, I'm going to try and increase the supply of organs by both taking them from overseas and buying them from people in this country. And the problem was that this gentleman, physician, turned out to have a long, long rap sheet. He had been convicted of Medicaid fraud numerous times. He'd run a Quaalude mill in an earlier life. He wasn't the paragon of the virtuous physician. And people looked at him and said, if that's the kind of person that's going to go into the organ sales business, then we're not going to have organ sales. And that's what crushed the idea of a market in organs. It wasn't really the philosophical or ethical arguments. It was the specter of this kind of person getting involved in the market side. Well, things have remained quiet until recently when Some individuals motivated oftentimes at some of the more conservative think tanks like Heritage and the American Enterprise Institute, and some transplant surgeons, my friend Art Matus at Minnesota would be one, began to say, let's revisit that idea of markets. Remember, that was the first idea I had up. They have proposed a modification to the National Organ Transplant Act. I'm not showing you the original law. The original law just says you can't pay anything for organs. It's pretty plain and simple. They want that law modified to allow individual states, as you can see from this language, to do what they might need to do to try and encourage organ donation, including allowing payments of cash to start to be offered. Now, this bill is being carried right now by Specter, the senator from Pennsylvania. And there's a whole debate that's erupting in the background here, letters, comments flying around about whether the National Organ Transplant Act should be modified. I'm on the side that says it should not. Quite simply, one reason I don't think you want to go in this direction is I don't think it's the source of resistance for people to make organs available, either living or dead, that they don't get money. The dead, when people don't donate, all the studies I've been involved with show that they don't want to make their organs available because they find it against their personal religious view, against their aesthetics, or they feel like the system doesn't do anything to get them an organ if they were going to die, so why should I make mine available to somebody else? It's a sort of reciprocity problem. But it's if you survey people and say, why didn't you make your organs available after your relative died, what you usually get back is not because they didn't offer me 20 grand. And if you ask them whether money would make a difference, they say no. So at least hypothetically, the survey data doesn't support the idea that money is what's a problem here. But let's go. Second problem, if you really put in markets, you're going to have to pay people a lot. Most living persons in the U.S., I don't think are going to be selling their kidneys for $100. I don't think that's the, even people from Lehman Brothers are unlikely to be out there hawking their kidney without a pretty good financial reward. I think you're going to have to pay a lot of money to get, and we're talking mainly kidneys here, out of individuals. And I think if that happens, you're going to skew the supply toward the rich and not have the equitable system that we try to drive for now. And it isn't always equitable and it has its problems, but we try to minimize money in terms of who has access. But if you tack on 100 grand, 150 grand to get that organ that you got to pay, I think that's going to skew the supply over to the people who can pay. Secondly, my old friends, the bishops, have not gone away. They are still opposed to the idea that you commercialize the body. And I'm going to tell you, you may not care what the Catholic Church says or evangelicals say or Orthodox Jews say about organ donation, although all of them came around to the view that organ donation was ethical, done altruistically. It is not, however, on any of those religious traditions acceptable to sell your body. Now, there's a long tradition about why that's so. Part of it has to do with it's not yours, it's God's, and you're the steward. It's a gift to you, and you don't own it, so you can't sell it. I don't want to get into the metaphysics of that here. All I'm going to tell you is the minute that bill passed, the Pope will come out and say, no Catholic can in conscience participate in that system. You're going to lose more than you get if you put that law through with markets. And I know it drives libertarians and economists, and that may be an overlapping set, completely nuts, but it's true that you have to care what religious opposition is going to be fostered because you don't want to bump out Catholics and evangelicals are probably 40% of your pool. You lose them, not only do you have to get that back, not only do you get more organs, you're going to have to get more and you're going to have to recoup these. I think it's trouble all the way. And you don't have to agree with their views or not. You need them as part of the community. It's another problem here, and it's not one for the public, it's one for doctors. So we have some docs here today, and the question boils down to this. Is it consistent with medical ethics to say, I'm going to remove a body part from you just so you can make money? So normally the idea of do no harm is that we're going to do things that might harm you in the short run, but you're going to benefit in terms of therapy. No one likes to get a prophylactic vaccination, Nobody's really interested in having their colon resected. No one really likes to, actually, now that I think of it, no one likes anything that doctors do. But nonetheless, having these things done, the justification for the doctor to do things that are painful or harmful or something that ordinarily we certainly wouldn't countenance between two adults is that the goal is to seek therapeutic benefit. What markets do is they say, you use your skills to make somebody worse off because they want to make money by selling their part, and you will have to partner with them in that activity. Is it consistent with medical ethics to have that done? And my answer clearly is no. That's going to make people not trust docs. They're going to start to think, well, what else would they whack off, take off, or do just in the interest of money? Not that the thought hasn't occurred to people, but it's going to reinforce it. There isn't much empirical evidence that you can regulate markets once you get them going. Probably the best case is this trafficking that I've mentioned a few times, where no one actually looks out for the people who sell. Despite a lot of noise that they do, nobody ever does. But if you want to take a market that's a little more regulated, look at international adoption. What international adoption basically is baby buying. And the rich get the babies, and that's how it works. And there's no doubt in my mind that all the effort to protect adoption, what we see happening now is kids who have parents are selling them to us. They're not coming from orphanages. They're coming from people who say, I can't support this kid, or I'm going to make the money myself. We basically have, as part of the adoption world, baby markets. That's why China closed down for a while, and Guatemala, some of their practices, they couldn't regulate this stuff, couldn't verify what was going on in terms of where the kids were coming from. I have human eggs up there as another market that hasn't worked very well for regulation. When people say you can have a regulated market, we're not going to exploit, we're not going to take advantage, I don't believe there's any evidence that any of these things can work, and everything that does exist out there doesn't show it. So bottom line, on the market idea, I think it would lead to potential loss of organs. It isn't something that people say they want. You don't hear people saying when someone dies, that's what would have made a difference to me. You're going to have to pay a ton of money in the relatively wealthy countries to get anybody to sell, living or dead, and that's going to skew who's going to get these organs. I think you're going to kick off religious opposition, the likes of which will damage the size of the pool of people who are out there. And I don't think there's any evidence that you can regulate this kind of market anyway, either here or overseas. So I think this idea is a bad idea. Whether I'm right or wrong, I wanted to flag it for you because it's going to become one of the first issues that the next Congress is going to wrestle with. That bill will be put in. Whoever's the president is actually probably going to have a shot, maybe if it doesn't get enacted prior to the end of Bush, to veto this thing or pass this thing or sign off on it. So it's rolling around, and it's something that you all as citizens need to be aware of. You know, I've given you my view, but in any event, you now know that's out there. So let me recap what I tried to do with you today. Is there a big need for organs? Yes. A huge need. It's bigger than, in fact, I think the numbers that are used. I'm willing to concede that. Do people die every day for want of organs? Yes. Do we have some obligation to help them get more organs? Yes. Some of the steps that are being taken, however, undermine public trust in what this system is. We don't kill people to get their parts. We don't coerce people to get their parts. We don't exploit people to get their parts. We don't give the organs just to the rich. We're not going to do things that hasten your death. We're not going to do things that make you worry or wonder whether or not we paid attention to your views. And many of these proposals, I think, are borderline or over the line risky in terms of respecting the older values that have been in place in the system. I don't think we should be changing those older values. Just so you see, there is one option that we might go to as a policy shift. For a long time, I think I wrote my first article about this in '83, I think the United States should go toward a system of presuming consent. Now, that's not the pituitary gland model where we just come along and yank out your parts. It is a model, however, that says the default assumption should be that you want to be a donor. If you don't want to be a donor, carry a card or register on a computer. You have every right to say no. There's nothing more respectful of informed consent by making people say yes and opt in than there is by making them say no and opt out. And you could set the system up as carefully as you like so that if there's any doubt, don't take the organ. I mean, you can go to a system that says, you know, we're going to presume it, but we won't do it. It has worked somewhat in Europe to boost up some of their donor rates. You do need to make some investment in infrastructure so that you have the right people asking about this when they appear. It's not just changing the law. But it seems to me that's the policy, presuming that people want to and then saying, if you don't want to, you have the ability, the right to say no. That might get us an increase in organs from cadaver sources in any event. If we standardize the system for living donation and really started to protect it more carefully, we could move forward with more confidence there and use more living sources, at least for kidneys. So I do think there are things we could do. I'm very worried about some of the things people are proposing that we try to do. And I'm very worried that, in fact, we might destroy some of the willingness of the American people to altruistically donate organs when they die, or to even think about being a living donor and helping a stranger or someone they don't know that well when they're alive. As I said, I'm not sure that extremism in pursuit of organs ought to be treated as a virtue. Thank you.
Let's take a few questions. We're running a little over time. There is a reception to follow, but if you'll bear with us and stick around, we'll still have some reception to go to.
I'm just wondering.
Please wait till the mic gets to you.
Oh, sorry.
I'll repeat it. Go ahead. You can.
Okay, I'm just wondering whether in areas where there's a lot of coercion and trafficking in human organs, whether there isn't an incentive by potential victims to actually become alcoholics or drug addicts or not eat well, so that the organs that they have are so bad that they're not coveted by those who would
Understood.
Appropriate them.
I think my life's work has been dedicated to ruining my own organs so that I wasn't faced with that choice. Actually, your question isn't quite, it's not quite what happens in the poorest nations, but having spent a little time now looking at the situation in India, a little time looking at Moldova, what you do see is this. People don't tell you the truth about their health. So if you have a market, what happens is people lie, and they don't tell you anything honest about what their history is or what their health experience has been, or what their exposures, what their risks are. They want the money. For those of you old enough to remember this, and I may be the only person here who is, the single step that we took that made the blood supply in the U.S. safe was to stop buying whole blood. When we stopped purchasing whole blood, the hepatitis infection rate moved from about 20% of blood recipients getting hepatitis to about 1%. And that was by removing whole blood. And what the problem was is that people lie. Today, one other comment on this, if you don't think that people lie to make money, go look at the sites where people sell sperm and eggs. Yes, I am a 7-foot Ukrainian mathematical genius. Yes, you can buy my egg here. I've won many tennis. I mean, who knows what these people actually have done or are saying, but everybody out there who's moving their gametes on the informal market of the internet is a wondrous exemplar of humanity. So you get a lot of lying is what you get. People cover up their problems to get the money.
Quick comment. Having been a student of Ali Schroeder in his constitutional law course, and in his first year it was Dr. Alan Moritz that he sponsored the first medical course with, I can tell you one of his hallmarks was the ability to treat profound, complicated subjects, serious nature, with a wit. He would have smiled on you today and appreciated
you.
it. Appreciated it very much, I'll tell you.
Thank you. I was listening when Professor Melman was doing the introduction about inviting a person of prominence and achievement. I was sure he was going to say, well, we couldn't do that, but then... Right here, yeah.
I wonder if you would comment on whether there's been any softening on the idea of prisoner donation in the U.S. I ask because the South Carolina legislature was at one point considering this, and also a thoracic surgeon recently wrote a novel in which he turns to that.
So here are the two problems with prisoners. One, they are living in pretty rotten healthcare circumstances. Two, they're living in highly infectious disease settings. So, if you want to find tuberculosis, HIV, Hep C, head right to the prison. And if you want to find people who don't get very good health care, go right to the prison. There's a third problem in using them as cadaver donors. You're going to have to execute them in ways that basically preserve their organs, which I think is going to require probably guillotining them. I mean, they're not, they don't die on life support. You're going to have to be in there, boom, and pull parts. When you start looking at the contraindications in terms of their health status, plus at the cadaver end, they're shot or hung or gassed or whatever, they're not dying on life support, they're not really a viable source for cadaver organs. They're not a great source even for living organs. So I wouldn't say I was opposed to living donation. Cadaver, I think, is hopeless and makes no sense. Living donation, there's some prisoners have donated to a relative and that sort of thing, but you got to realize they're in tough medical shape. So they're a harder group to deal with frequently than the average citizen. There are transplant people here who can confirm this when I say it. The other thing that's tricky, when you get organs or blood from a relative, you have to be wary because the biggest line goes on when the person is your relative. Nobody says, that was only my 15th trip to prostitutes this month. Try my kidney. I mean, they won't tell you the truth, and prisoners don't do it either, so that's another difficulty in this.
So what would you think about a system where there was some incentive such that if you were, the longer you had been on a transplant list, as a donor list, the greater your priority would be within groups for receiving a transplant?
So there is a country that actually operates this way. Singapore has what you might term ethically a reciprocity system. If you sign up and indicate a willingness, I've actually thought, well, maybe you could actually sign up and recruit other people. Let's go to like Girl Scout cookies, or, you have these, I recruited 12 new donors, so I get more points. The problem is, in pluralistic America, multi-ethnic America, it's hard to get matches. And so by the time you get size numbers big enough that you'd find a match, you're basically starting to move into systems that have everybody signed up, or a lot of people signed up.
I don't mean on an individual basis, but on a population basis, so that we all take our chances with life, and some of us live
I see what
until
you
we
mean.
die without needing a transplant.
I see.
But when you sign up at 20,
Yeah.
and if at 40 you need a transplant, your priority would be higher had you been on the
The
list.
earlier you went.
Yeah, exactly.
I have no problem with that kind of incentivized system at all. It seems to me, you're not going to threaten the dead donor rule, violate anybody's altruism. It would be useful to try and shift the recruitment of people out of motor vehicles and into some other settings like high schools and schools where it makes more sense to have discussions and question and answer. I'm serious, motor vehicles, that is just not the place to have these conversations and get questions answered when you have them. Schools are, and so I like that idea. So yeah, I don't have an issue with that. And I should be clear about one other thing that Dr. Letterman reminds me of. I keep harping tonight that I don't like money changing hand for parts, but I don't think you have to make your organ donor poor. So if you take time off from the job and you stay in a hotel and you need a babysitter and you have to go to a restaurant, you should have that compensated. And I wouldn't oppose even saying you ought to have some insurance. I was on the board of something called the National Marrow Donor Program for many years, and we offered health and life insurance to anybody who was a bone marrow donor. And I pushed that because it seemed to me if you're going to risk harming yourself to do this, then you ought to have some coverage. So I don't have any, this is not an argument against not giving people their just reward and not asking them to sacrifice, so to speak, to do it. I get nervous when I see big incentives come forward. Why don't you get the last question, because I know we got to go out to the...
You mentioned the new Harvard criteria for determining cardiac death. I think previously a Harvard commission determined
brain
death. Would you say it would be ethical if the higher brain criteria was adopted by such a commission, that the harvesting of those that are in persistent vegetative states, organs, would be ethical?
So, didn't get into it tonight, but it's a great question. We now require we require brain death, complete and irreversible loss of all integrated brain function to have cadaver donation proceed. One idea that's out there is allow people to also donate who fall into a permanent vegetative state like Terry Schiavo. The difficulty is we're not as good at determining permanent vegetative state until post-mortem. So the scanning techniques, the blood flow techniques are pretty good, but they're not the 100% reliability that you get out of total and irreversible loss of all integrated brain function. It's diagnostic accuracy that drives this thing and builds trust. If you think about the Shivo case and how hard families, they have a hard time accepting PVS when they see someone who's still grimacing or gagging or producing tears or doing other things that make them think they're still there, it's hard. You still might say, what about letting people volunteer at that end? And that's something that at least could be discussed. I mean, it's one thing to say everybody whose PVS is eligible. It's another thing to say, I can sign my donor card and say, if I'm PVS, treat me that way and I'm not worried about it. And that might be a way to expand the pool. There aren't a lot of people, though, that are PVS. It's only about 10,000. You're not going to get huge numbers. It's not a big group.
So let me ask for another round of applause.
Thank you.
Caplan, we have a presentation for you to commemorate your visit with us as the Oliver C. Schroeder Junior Scholar in Residence for this year. We will gladly send it to your place if you'd rather not.
That'll never get through airport security.
Well, they'll charge you $15 for it. So please join us right outside here for refreshments.
So that,
Great job.